Hi everybody, Chris of the Polish Geek, and welcome to another video, a ranking video. And with The Mandalorian and Grogu out and me reviewing it only yesterday, I decided that it's finally about time to rank all 13 at this point. Yes, all 13 Star Wars movies, from the worst to the best. In a way you can say from my least favorite to my favorite. Yes, because like I've had my channel since 2022, but I finally decided that now, finally, is the time to rank all 13 Star Wars movies. I mean, this is one of those videos I wanted to make ever since the channel was created, but never found really an opportunity. But now, again, with The Mandalorian and Grogu out, now is probably better time than ever, right? Well, and remember, the first thing I wanted to say to all the people who are watching this video, yes, I'm one of the huge sequel haters actually, and for that matter, what Disney has done to Star Wars in general. That's not to say that there weren't good things, like there were, and I might mention some in that video when it makes sense in context, but yes, I'm one of the biggest sequel haters you'll ever find. I think what Kathleen Kennedy did completely damaged the brand and all, and like the sequels were completely lore-breaking, so yep. I really hate them. But if you love them, then it's not my place to be telling you what you should and shouldn't love. I mean, it's your choice, and it's not my place to be telling you what you should or shouldn't love. This is just my personal list. My opinion only, okay? So, let's get this out of the way. And by the way, I'm also planning to do rewriting of the sequels. Basically, rewrite the whole story, and basically, how would I write it if I was the Disney executive and one of the writers, like, what would be my story for the Star Wars sequels. And I will very much keep several of the elements that I actually liked in the sequels, actually, like several of the characters, and also, yeah, you have that. But then again, it won't be anytime soon though, likely next year most likely, actually, when I will do those rewrites of Star Wars sequel trilogy. But for now, let's get to the ranking of all the 13 Star Wars movies, from the worst to the best. And coming at number 13, at the last place, the worst Star Wars movie in existence is The Rise of Skywalker. And yes, like, the minute they announced the return of Palpatine, that was completely breaking for me. Like, I always despise, Dark Empire comics. Like, I always found that the return of Palpatine was completely inexcusable, unacceptable. It completely destroys the amazing ending of Return of the Jedi, and the moment where Vader throws Palpatine down the shaft, and it completely kills Vader's redemption. It kills the whole victory of the Rebels in Return of the Jedi. Like, it's still beyond me. There are people out in the world that think bringing Palpatine in any way back is a good idea. Like, oh my gosh. And I heard that, oh, he was the main villain, he should complete it. Well, no. He was defeated in Return of the Jedi, and bringing him back in any way simply completely undoes that. So, yeah, by bringing Palpatine alone, it already puts it in this very bottom list, but even then, it completely retcons the whole Last Jedi. And I'm someone who very much hates The Last Jedi, but even as someone who hates The Last Jedi, I still think basically retconning everything and basically the whole summary of the movie being Last Jedi bad, actually causes more problems than it tries to solve. Because thing is, it's clear that the J.J. Abrams was very much went to great lengths to win the crowd that obviously was never going to be won back anyway, and if anything, only created even more problems that the story already had. Like, compare it to Duel of the Fates script by Colin Trevorrow. Like, although I won't say that the script doesn't have any problems, but that script manages the impossible, because it's a really amazing script. And if Duel of the Fates actually was the version we got, although I suppose that many of the things in there are actually rough drafts, which is for the better, because it's not perfect and there are still plenty of problems with the script actually. They just don't seem that obvious on the first read, but yes, like, The Rise of Skywalker is simply the worst thing they could have ever come up. And even some of the things that actually looked pretty cool, like the Red Sith Troopers, they're barely in a movie actually. And even the whole idea that Rey is Palpatine's granddaughter, and then the book revealing that her father is just one of Palpatine's failed clones. Like, this is simply, all of that is simply plain insane, stupid, and just Makes no sense whatsoever. And also one more thing about Duel of the Fates. What Duel of the Fates manages to do is that it manages to be an amazing, well-written script. I mean, again, it does have problems, but it manages to be an overall incredible script without retconning The Last Jedi. And I'm someone who hates The Last Jedi, but yes, The Rise of Skywalker, by basically trying to retcon The Last Jedi, and Star Wars was beyond saving in my eyes anyway at this point. I mean, maybe not Star Wars, but the sequel trilogy was beyond saving anyway at this point, but The Rise of Skywalker, by basically trying to retcon The Last Jedi, basically burn whole thing down, and that's why The Rise of Skywalker is at number 13, the worst Star Wars movie in existence. And coming in number 12 is, yes, the aforementioned The Last Jedi. And yes, I was one of those people actually that the minute the title was announced, I was already even frightened and having suspicions. This doesn't sound good. Like The Last Jedi, seriously? The sequel should be about rebuilding the Jedi or being already rebuilt, but the title itself already gave away that basically, yes, they were going to double down on the problems that The Force Awakens started of the Jedi being completely wiped out, but the actual movie was worse than I could have thought. Like then there is a scene when the ship basically crashes through light speed, all the bigger ships, like seriously? Like, didn't know that was possibly could ever been done. Like, if that's the case, then why didn't just Luke use light speed to destroy the Death Star in the New Hope? But even then, while it is a cool action scene, it just doesn't make sense narrative-wise. But even then, it's just a single scene, which doesn't change the fact that overall movie just doesn't make sense. And then there is a cringy casino scene. Like, Star Wars was never about comedy. I mean, yeah, it did have comedic elements, but certainly not that over the top like the casino scene. The casino scene still is one of the worst scenes in Star Wars history. Actually, possibly the worst, actually. And then basically completely killing off Snoke without giving him any backstory. And I don't want a bullshit excuse of, oh, Palpatine didn't have a backstory in the original trilogy. Sorry, but Palpatine wasn't an original character in a pre-established universe, so that's an entirely different situation, so I don't ever want to hear this bullshit, Emperor didn't have a backstory excuse. Again, the Emperor wasn't an original character in a pre-established universe, so I'm not buying into that bullshit excuse. And what I did like though, the one thing I did like in The Last Jedi is the relationship between Kylo Ren and Rey and their psychic way of basically communicating with each other. That was pretty cool, and Star Wars is built on relationships, but even then you can just say, some would then say then, it's a good movie but terrible Star Wars movie. And again, even Rian Johnson basically said that he basically didn't care about any movies before, he only cared about telling the story he was writing at the moment. And that's what happens when you don't take consideration of the lore and anything and just focus on the current story in front of you. Then you come up with a mess of the movie that completely breaks the lore. But the final thing I gotta talk about that I haven't mentioned, but it's probably the most important, what they have done to Luke Skywalker is completely inexcusable. Like, that's the guy that tried to redeem his father, Darth Vader, the second most evil man in the galaxy next to the Emperor himself. But now his nephew struggles with some darkness, so he just takes out the lightsaber and tries to kill him. And people say it's a few-minute impulse. Sorry, but there is a world difference between allowing your father to provoke you by telling that he'll turn your sister to the dark side in Return of the Jedi versus just straight up raising a lightsaber in front of your nephew that just struggles with some dark thoughts. But yes, The Last Jedi is the second worst Star Wars movie in existence, only next to The Rise of Skywalker. Again, The Rise of Skywalker managed the impossible of being the worst Star Wars movie ever, but before The Rise of Skywalker, The Last Jedi was the worst. It's a huge competition which of those two is really a worst movie, but doesn't change the fact that they are both completely lore-breaking and destroying of the Star Wars universe. Coming in number 11 is probably the most pointless Star Wars movie in existence, and that's Solo: A Star Wars Story. And yes, when I first watched Solo: A Star Wars Story, I actually was really entertained, and I was saying, oh, this movie is very underrated. People only hate it because of The Last Jedi and they still have bitter taste in their mouth. And then I actually even went to the theater the second time and still really enjoyed it back then actually, and was a huge defender of this movie. Actually, yep. Can you imagine it, folks? I was one of those few people that actually saw Solo, a Star Wars story, twice, even though in general that movie lost money, but whatever. I saw Solo, a Star Wars story, twice back in the day when it came out, and was a huge defender of this movie, saying Death to Last Jedi, Solo all the way. But the more time has passed and the more time I realize this movie simply isn't as good as I first thought it was. The reason I really loved it upon the first watch, because I admit I really love this Western Wild West style to it, and I also really enjoyed that there was this Corellia planet from the expanded universe, the planet Han Solo originated from. So yeah, I like Corellia, and I also thought that the Castle Run was a really cool action scene, and even that last Darth Maul cameo at the end was pretty cool. Plus, after the Castle Run there was this black hole, and I was always fascinated by the black hole, so actually seeing black hole in Star Wars universe was really made a smile on my face. But over time I ultimately realized that what really matters the most in a good movie and good story is good storytelling and likable characters. And this movie certainly doesn't have that. The story is, again, pointless and just story that is, nothing else. It's not a bad story, and it's not necessarily offensively bad in the way of the sequel trilogy, but it's just a story that's simply not interesting and not very engaging, especially that Han Solo does really need a backstory. The cool thing about Han Solo actually is that he's this smuggler, and by giving him a backstory that really makes him sympathetic, kind of completely kills what type of a man Han Solo becomes in the original trilogy, because Han Solo's character development in the original trilogy was one of our favorite things about Han Solo. So by basically giving him a backstory that he was a spirited young man that then went on a dark path because of the life he led, then it kind of detracts from that. Because thing is, again, we like Han Solo as a selfish smuggler that then undergoes a character development, but basically giving him a backstory of how he came to be this selfish smuggler in the first place kind of kills all that. And then combine it also with this cringy L3 robot, because yeah, when I first watched it I was thinking that that robot meant to be for comedic purposes, and I actually found it really hilarious and even saw this robot as a parody of Kathleen Kennedy. But the more time passed I realized that this was obviously not a parody, that this all meant to be serious, especially this cringy scene when Lando actually straight up goes up and tries to basically risk his life to save her. Like when she said that Lando has a crush on her, that was kind of hilarious and could be seen as a robot completely not understanding any clues. But then when you see Lando actually risking his life straight up to save the robot that was destroyed anyway, then clearly you start thinking, maybe that was not a joke, maybe this is meant to be serious. And we know that Disney obviously wouldn't make it into a parody, even though it very much fits into a parody. And also, yeah, even though I used to think that L3 was basically a parody of Kathleen Kennedy, and the whole thing she thinks Lando has a crush on her meant to be for comedic purposes, I mean, this is Disney and Kennedy, so unfortunately I don't think this was for comedy. This was likely very, very serious. And then basically putting her into a Millennium Falcon, which retroactively kind of destroys the Millennium Falcon later. Yep. Solo is a movie that I really enjoyed the first time I watched it, and even the second time I watched it, and even a year after I still had kind of fondness to it, but over time I realized it's just not a good movie. It's a movie that your emotions kind of tell you it's good because you love this wild western style to it, and the Castle Run is pretty cool admittedly, but the more time passes and the more you give it much thought, you realize how badly written the story of Solo actually is, and how the characters are completely bland and unlikable. And that's why Solo, a Star Wars story, the most pointless Star Wars movie in existence, and that's like a compliment now after I ranted about it, ends up here at number 11. And at number 10 is also a perfect example of a movie that time hasn't been kind to, probably embodiment of actually, and that's Star Wars Episode 7, The Force Awakens. And yes, because when I first went to the theaters to see this movie, I remember how the whole theater was packed, and then me and my family, we were all so excited actually to see Star Wars is back, baby. And yeah, there was a big line to the theaters actually, and then when I was sitting in my seat in the theater and this famous Star Wars logo popped up, I was like, yep, that's how I felt. And then even after the movie ended, I was so like overjoyed and feeling, wow, Star Wars is back, I'm in heaven. And then I was even willing to see this movie again, actually, and yep, I still remember how big phenomenon it was even before the movie actually came out and then after. But the more time I realized, that the reason I loved the movie so much in the first place on my first watch was because it was nostalgia. I watched it and then all the nostalgia kicked in and I had a great time, but over time I realized the movie simply isn't as good as it seems at first. Like even my sister's ex, actually husband back then, but ex at this point, even back then actually said, because he went to see this movie with me actually, and my sister, we went to see this movie together back then. After the movie ended, he was actually saying, it's just a rehash of A New Hope. And then the more I started giving it thought, the more I realized that he was indeed correct. And even the more you think about it, the more you realize that the many problems that Last Jedi very much started in The Force Awakens. Like another Death Star, seriously, but now it can destroy entire star system, and then the Jedi being wiped out once again, and even basically the new rebellion just now called the Resistance, and even seemingly weaker than the rebellion. Like this movie basically completely already undone the happy ending of Return of the Jedi. I mean, later two movies very much doubled on that, but there are plenty of problems that very much I have with The Last Jedi and The Rise of Skywalker very much started here in The Force Awakens. It's just that, once again, when I first watched it, people were a lot hungry for Star Wars and very nostalgic, and the nostalgia immediately kicked in, and that's why many people told themselves this movie was way better than it actually was, including me, actually, because back then I was even going as far as to say, oh, it's among the best Star Wars movies. Can you imagine it? But The Force Awakens is basically an embodiment of time. That time can really best tell quality. Like, that's the ultimate lesson I took from The Force Awakens. The best way you can tell the movie's quality is time. And one more thing I want to say, no, I'm not one of those people that's going to rant about Rey and say, oh, I hate Rey. No, because newsflash, I'm one of the few people that actually thinks Rey is a great character. I love Rey. I think that she had a huge potential. It's just that the script written about her didn't really give her any chance to really shine, or any character development and actually be as awesome as she could potentially be. Again, I love Rey. I think she's a really great character. It's just that the story written around her is trash. And that actually even makes it more sad, actually, because I think she's a great character who's simply ruined by a story written about her. And that's why I will give this spoiler alert for my rewrites of the sequel trilogy. Rey is staying. I know most people probably beg me to basically remove Rey from the sequel trilogy, but no, Rey is staying. Yes, she's going to get a training in my version of the sequel trilogy, and she's certainly not going to be this powerful and beat Kylo Ren on her first fight, for sure not, but she's very much staying, still played by Daisy Ridley in my version of the sequel trilogy, so you betcha that I'm very much keeping Rey, because I actually love Rey. I just think that the story written around her was trash, but this is basically an example that shows that even though I keep saying that the likable, well-written characters are the most important thing to a good story, but it doesn't change the fact that shows that even a great character can totally not really make up for much when the story written around the script is pure trash, and The Force Awakens is a living embodiment of that. Once again, in conclusion, I love Rey, but I really hate any story written around her, and that's why I don't like The Force Awakens, and it's here at number 10 on this list. Coming at number 9, and yes, my number 9 and number 8 actually kinda go back and forth now, because my number 9 is the very most recent Star Wars movie actually, The Mandalorian and Grogu. And yes, everything I said in my review yesterday pretty much is how I feel about this movie. The best way I can describe it is that it's very much a kids movie, and I think it will mostly appeal to the 10-year-olds, 12-year-olds. Yeah, I think this is very much what The Mandalorian and Grogu is aimed at. And even then, I just think the movie is completely pointless and doesn't bring much into the Star Wars universe. Not that I wanted it to, because again, I don't trust Disney, so I think the fact that they just decided to basically do a side quest adventure of the Mandalorian and Grogu was actually for the best, but at the end of the day, I just think it's completely pointless, and I think that maybe the people who are still clinging to loving the Mandalorian and Grogu will enjoy this, but I've moved on at this point. Again, when the Mandalorian first came out, I very much loved the show, especially the first season actually, and I still do like the first season actually, but then season 2, even when I first watched it, I was very much, oh, this is the way, this is awesome, this is splendid. And I didn't have a YouTube channel back then, so you'll not see any of the videos me praising season 2, because again, that was before I created this channel actually, but over time I realized that season 2 ultimately is nothing but cameo fest. And then the Book of Boba Fett completely ruined everything by basically bringing Grogu back the Mandalorian. So, and then the season 3, people say season 3 was bad, but the more you think about it, the more you realize that the minute Grogu came back the Mandalorian, the Book of Boba Fett, season 3 had no way to ever work in any way, shape or form. So, if you're still one of those people that still clings to some more adventures with the Mandalorian and Grogu, then I think you might enjoy this movie. But if you're someone like most people, including me, who's moved on, because if it wasn't for the fact I moved on already, I probably wouldn't even, I mean, if it wasn't for the fact I have this YouTube channel, what am I saying? Sorry, I got lost. But yeah, if it wasn't for the fact I have this YouTube channel, I would even go to see this movie in the first place. But ultimately, I think that The Mandalorian and Grogu is somewhat entertaining, completely harmless, movie for kids that ultimately doesn't really have much effect, and it's just a movie that is, I say. So again, for those that still are very much clinging for more of the Mandalorian and Grogu adventures, and I think there are very little of those people, but for those, I think this might be a fun, high Star Wars adventure movie. But for most who's moved on, then this is basically another really pointless movie that just is and nothing else. And at number 8, and I already said that the two actually very much go back and forth, but the reason I chose to go with my number 8 here, because that's the Clone Wars movie. And the reason I chose to put the Clone Wars a little above the Mandalorian and Grogu, even though I think they're pretty much the same in quality actually, and pretty much the same in style and everything, the reason I chose to go with the Clone Wars movie as little above is because the Clone Wars did admittedly give a birth to a really incredible Star Wars show, the Clone Wars. Yep, I'm a huge fan of the Clone Wars, and even back in 2023 I gave it the whole you should be watching treatment actually, and I very much haven't changed my mind ever. I still really adore the Clone Wars. I think it's a really splendid, incredible show, especially the later season. It gets really good. It's honestly one of my favorite works in Star Wars existence. Oh my gosh, words cannot express how much I love the Clone Wars. But at the same time, I think the Clone Wars, the movie, is certainly not the best pilot to it, actually. Especially that it almost feels like 4 episodes of one of the worst Clone Wars arcs, because there are plenty of really incredible Clone Wars arcs, but the movie of them all is possibly the worst one of them all. It's basically just a big side quest of rescuing Jabba the Hutt's son, and I never even liked the idea of Jabba the Hutt having this son. By basically showing the softer side of Jabba the Hutt, completely kills what an evil gangster he later is in Return of the Jedi. And even then, the world building isn't particularly great in this movie, which very much contrasts with the really fantastic world building of the actual show, actually. Because yeah, the world building in the Clone Wars show is probably better than it ever was in Star Wars, but it's not so good in the Clone Wars, the movie. And even then, ultimately, this movie doesn't bring much into the Star Wars lore or story. Once again, in contrast to the show, but if someone only watches the Clone Wars based on the pilot alone, then I wouldn't blame them for not wanting to start the show, because this is honestly a really terrible pilot to a really excellent show. And also, it introduces Ahsoka Tano, who's possibly my favorite Star Wars character, actually, next to Darth Vader only, but even then, she's kinda actually really annoying in this. She's kinda annoying spoiled brat, actually. So it's really incredible that the show managed to later make her my second most favorite character in all of Star Wars, actually. Although she has outstayed her welcome at this point. She should have died in Rebels, be killed by Vader. I made a whole opinion piece video on that as well. But yeah, let's just say the Clone Wars, the movie, really bad pilot to a really incredible show. And by the way, I've seen people saying that they really would love the Clone Wars finale to have a movie actually, and I will say this. If the Siege of Mandalore was made into a movie, then it would very much rank possibly the top 3 or 4 actually. Top 4 or maybe even top 3, yeah, that's where very much it would rank if Siege of Mandalore was made into the movie. But I never found the need to make it into the movie. I think Siege of Mandalore is perfect as a show finale. No need to make it into the movie, and ultimately the Clone Wars movie is a terrible pilot to an incredible show. And now, the following 7 movies, I say none of those movies are bad at this point. They very much range from entertaining, enjoyable to straight up masterpieces, like my number 2 and 1 are I consider straight up masterpieces on this list, but again, none of the following 7 movies are bad actually. The worst I can describe them is entertaining, enjoyable, but none of them are bad. In fact, from now on, the following 7, I really like all of those movies actually. But yes, my number 7 and number 6 also kind of go back and forth actually, and I was very much almost tempted to put on my number 6, number 7, but ultimately decided that at this moment at least I felt like putting this one at number 7, because number 7 is certainly the worst of the original 6 Star Wars movies, and that's Attack of the Clones. And fun fact about Attack of the Clones, it was actually the very first Star Wars movie I've seen in theaters. I was 7 years old and my father took me and my classmate from elementary school, he took us both, and I remember how much we both loved this movie back then. But then again, we were 7-year-old kids, so what do you expect from 7-year-old kids who are only excited by special effects? But yes, Attack of the Clones is the very first Star Wars movie I've seen in theaters actually, and now when I got older, I realized how much flaws it actually had, but there is still a lot to love and enjoy in this movie. But first the flaws, and the problem is that the CGI is really terrible actually, and basically so much stuff looks so fake and all, because that's actually one of the biggest problems of Star Wars prequels in general, an overall overusage of CGI, and in Attack of the Clones it very much shows that actually. But besides even the overusage of CGI, there is just no chemistry between Anakin and Padme, because the problem is that their romance is just so terribly written, and it almost feels like Anakin basically mind-forced Padme into loving him actually. And I'm certain that that's not what George Lucas obviously intended actually, but unfortunately George Lucas is not a good scriptwriter, and that's why it often comes off as that actually, because Attack of the Clones is an embodiment of what George Lucas is. He's an incredible visionary with really incredible ideas, but unfortunately he's not a good scriptwriter, and Attack of the Clones very much embodies it. And also, don't even get me started on Hayden Christensen's terrible acting. Lots of people very much hate Anakin Skywalker, saying that he's a terrible character and completely unlike anything they imagined from the way he was described in the original trilogy, and that largely stems from Hayden Christensen's terrible acting. Yeah, because the acting of Hayden Christensen is simply terrible. But of course, there is still a lot to love in Attack of the Clones, because I actually think the overall story of the Attack of the Clones is good. It's just that it's not executed well, because George Lucas is not a good script writer, but I think the overall story is actually good, and it's nice to see the beginning of the Clone Wars and how it all later will lead to the Anakin's fall, like especially the scene where Anakin actually, when Anakin's mother dies, and then there's first dark side moment in him where he basically slaughters the Sand People, and then also I think Count Dooku is a really incredible villain, and Christopher Lee does such a splendid job portraying him. Yep. By the way, Christopher Lee is still one of my favorite actors, and Count Dooku is easily one of my favorite roles of his. Yep. Christopher Lee just kills it as Count Dooku. And then there is also Ewan McGregor as Obi-Wan. That's probably one of the best parts of prequels as a whole, because Ewan McGregor is just always incredible as Obi-Wan. And then Natalie Portman as Padme Amidala is also pretty good. In fact, most of the cast I say is pretty good, except for Hayden Christensen. And also, the Battle of Geonosis is really awesome. Overall, I do think that Attack of the Clones is a good movie, and it does have a good story. At the same time, because George Lucas is a very bad scriptwriter, it does have a lot, and I mean a lot of flaws. And once again, it's an embodiment of who George Lucas is. He's an incredible visionary, but terrible scriptwriter, and that just shows in other prequels in general as well. But now, at number 6, and that's what I almost was tempted to put at number 7 actually, but ultimately I decided that this final battle is just too amazing, so I put it ultimately here at number 6, and that's the best of all the Disney Star Wars movies, and the only good one actually, because that's Rogue One, a Star Wars story. And yes, lots of people really love Rogue One, and I wouldn't necessarily call myself like a gigantic fan that plenty of other people are, because many people praise it as basically the best thing Star Wars ever. Actually, there are even some people that go as far as to say that it's the best Star Wars movie. Nope, absolutely not. Like, there is a lot to love in Rogue One, and I certainly do love the final battle. Like, the final space battle is probably still easily the most incredible battle in Star Wars history, and even the final land battle that accompanies this space battle, yeah, this is probably the best action scene in Star Wars history. I won't argue with that. And the Vader scene, so amazing. I mean, who doesn't love Darth Vader? He's like one of the most popular villains for a reason, possibly my favorite one, actually. So yes, the things I love in Rogue One, I really, really love. But also, the biggest problem I say of Rogue One is the middle half, when the characters start talking and all, because thing is, a lot of the characters aren't particularly interesting or have much depth, and they're kind of boring actually. And that's why I think that it's just hard to get engaged in the middle half of Rogue One, because most characters, not all, I actually like the two leads of Rogue One actually, which is maybe why it manages to make it all the way here to number 6 actually. But yeah, a lot of the characters are basically so bland, boring, that it's just hard to get engaged in that. Like, scenes with the Empire are actually way more interesting actually. But overall, I think that while I'm not necessarily religiously obsessed with Rogue One like a lot of Star Wars fans seem to be, I do very much agree that it's easily the best of all the Disney Star Wars movies, and the only good one actually. And once again, the final space and land battle, both of them actually, is probably the most incredible Star Wars action scene in existence actually. I mean, with the exception of several lightsaber battles, but that's ultimately a different story. Rogue One at number 6. Coming in number 5, and that on the other hand is the first Star Wars movie I ever saw in my life, because, well, Attack of the Clones is the first one I ever seen in theaters, but then my number 5 is the very first one I've seen in my life actually, and that's Star Wars The Phantom Menace. And yes, I really like this movie. Like, I know that this movie was very much hated upon the release by original trilogy fans, and there are still plenty of people that very much hate it, but anytime I watch The Phantom Menace, I'm sorry, I just can't do anything but still very much love this movie. And I won't argue that there aren't any flaws in this movie, because there very much are, but for me the positives just outweigh any of the negatives. Like, I've never really hated Jar Jar Binks as much as most people did, and as the Disney Star Wars has proved, there was a potential for a lot, and I mean a lot of worse characters than Jar Jar Binks. So yeah, I won't rant about Jar Jar Binks, because I never really had much problems with him. Maybe because I've seen The Phantom Menace as a kid actually, possibly because of that, but oh well, I never had problems with Jar Jar Binks. But I also think the final duel with Darth Maul is still the most incredible lightsaber duel in Star Wars history, and I really, really love Darth Maul. He's my second favorite Star Wars villain, only next to Darth Vader. The Clone Wars made him even better, but I still think he was really incredible in The Phantom Menace. And all the talk about the politics of Trade Federation and all is one of the biggest, most criticized aspects of this movie. But again, yes, I admit, as a kid, I did find scenes on Coruscant actually pretty boring, but now when I'm an adult, I actually find it pretty interesting and fascinating. Actually, putting some politics actually makes sense, considering that we're going from democracy to the Empire in the original trilogy. I think political talk actually makes sense, even if a lot of people find it boring actually. And another thing I love about The Phantom Menace is introduction of many new planets like Naboo. Naboo, by the way, is possibly my favorite planet in all of Star Wars. But also, we are revisiting Tatooine as well, and Coruscant, and we see the Jedi Council, and we see also how Anakin as a kid actually was taken by the Jedi Order. And one more thing, I also really love Qui-Gon Jinn. Qui-Gon Jinn is still easily one of my favorite characters in all of Star Wars. I love Qui-Gon Jinn, and Liam Neeson is just perfect for the role. Yup. I won't argue that Phantom Menace doesn't have flaws, because it does. But once again, for me, the positives just outweigh any of the negatives. Again, the world building is incredible with many new fantastic planets like Naboo or Coruscant. Qui-Gon Jinn is incredible. Darth Maul is a fantastic villain, and the final lightsaber duel is still easily the best lightsaber duel of all of Star Wars. Yep. And I do like the Gungans, actually. Yes. As I said, I have no problem with Jar Jar Binks, but the Gungans I actually love, and I think their underwater city is really incredible. And it goes back to the point how I say that the world building in the Phantom Menace is incredible. Yup, I love the Phantom Menace. It's the first Star Wars movie I ever seen, and that's why I'll always have a soft spot for it. Number 4, and that's the movie that I say, in my eyes, is almost completely flawless, actually. And I was actually even tempted to put it at number 3, actually, but for reasons I will mention when we get to number 3, actually, I ultimately decided to put it at number 4, even though I was this close to put it at number 3. And if I made the video only last year, I would very much put it at number 3, actually. Like, I only changed my mind in the last month, actually. But yes, coming in number 4 is Revenge of the Sith. And yes, I'll die on the hill saying that Revenge of the Sith is a really fantastic, incredible movie, and I hardly see any flaws in it. Other than maybe Hayden Christensen still isn't the best actor, but other than that, and maybe his turn to the dark side is objectively kind of rushed, actually, but then again, other than that, I say Revenge of the Sith is really incredible. In fact, I still remember that that was the first movie in theaters I've seen 3 times, actually. I remember that back when I was 11 years old, actually, me and several guys from my class, actually, we all very much were so excited to see Revenge of the Sith, and my father took me, as did their parents, actually, take them separately. But yes, we all then came back to school the next day, and we were talking how incredible this movie is, but yep, nothing has changed. I still very much love Revenge of the Sith. And also in some ways, it could be seen as the darkest Star Wars movie, like the whole Purge of the Jedi is really dark, but it's also the movie where we finally see the transition from the Republic democracy to the Empire, actually. And I think that George Lucas does it really well, and the action is simply splendid, and again, everything in Revenge of the Sith is just terrible. Even if Anakin's turn to the dark side is objectively kind of rushed, it still, in my opinion, doesn't detract or take away or diminish this tragedy in any way, shape or form. And again, the action is spectacular, the lightsaber battles are amazing. Yes, the best one is still in the Phantom Menace, but I think that Revenge of the Sith also has some of the best lightsaber battles, like the beginning of Anakin and Obi-Wan versus Count Dooku, or the final duel on Mustafar between Anakin and Obi-Wan. But yes, Revenge of the Sith, I'm almost tempted to say it's original trilogy quality. Like, I almost have zero problems with Revenge of the Sith. This movie is incredible, and I will die on the hill saying that Revenge of the Sith is fantastic. Again, I was this close of putting it at number 3, actually, but ultimately decided that, due to reasons I'm about to explain soon, that it belongs at number 4, but it still doesn't change the fact of how much I love this movie. And also, if you watch the Clone Wars and the Clone Wars finale, actually, it makes it even better, actually. I mean, Revenge of the Sith is a really incredible movie even without the Clone Wars, but yes, if you watch the Clone Wars, and I'm a huge fan of this show, I've already said, and then you watch Revenge of the Sith after finishing the Clone Wars, then it makes it even better. And I think this was a fantastic movie even without that. But yes, Revenge of the Sith was this close at putting it at number 3, but even at number 4, it's still among the best Star Wars movies, and still, I really love this movie. And coming number 3 is Return of the Jedi. And I think it was pretty predictable when I started talking about Revenge of the Sith and it almost being number 3. I think it was pretty predictable that Return of the Jedi will be instead at number 3, because while Return of the Jedi is widely and rightfully considered as the worst of the original trilogy, that doesn't say much because the original trilogy is a masterpiece. So even if Return of the Jedi is maybe not necessarily as good as its two predecessors, it's still a really, really incredible movie and a wonderful conclusion to the original trilogy. Like from the beginning sequence of Luke Skywalker rescuing his friends at Jabba's palace, and then to him becoming the Jedi and finally taking a last stand against his father Darth Vader, and then Darth Vader redeeming himself and throwing the Emperor down the shaft to the final celebration at Endor. Yep, Return of the Jedi, what I'm saying, is easily a really incredible conclusion to a really fantastic trilogy. Again, the one flaw that many people point out, and I won't necessarily argue that they do have a point, is the Ewoks, but ultimately no big deal in grand scheme of things. If anything, it's actually an interesting way to basically make parallels of the natives of the planet, which the Ewoks are, fighting against the evil, oppressive Empire, and it's pretty consistent actually with the Empire basically trying to oppress the whole galaxy. So ultimately, I have not much problems with the Ewoks, all that much actually. But overall, I think Return of the Jedi is a really great conclusion to the original trilogy. Again, the reason I ultimately decided to put Return of the Jedi above Revenge of the Sith is because Return of the Jedi is very essential basically. Like, it's a conclusion to the preceding two movies and a very incredible one at that, so I decided that Return of the Jedi is a lot more essential than Revenge of the Sith, so that's why I ultimately decided to go with Return of the Jedi at number 3, but that's just the fact that both are really incredible movies and they kind of do go back and forth. And one more thing I want to mention before we get to number 2 and 1 actually, and everyone already knows what those will be, it's pretty predictable, but one more thing I want to mention about Return of the Jedi is, fun fact, when I was a kid actually, that actually was my favorite actually of all of them, possibly because seeing Vader throw the Emperor down the shaft actually, and then basically this happy ending, maybe that's why it was always my favorite when I was a kid. But yes, as a little kid, until Revenge of the Sith came out in theaters, as a little kid, Return of the Jedi was very much my favorite Star Wars movie. Then Revenge of the Sith came out and it dethroned it actually back then actually, but yep, until I was 11 and saw Revenge of the Sith in theaters, Return of the Jedi was very much my favorite. But in some ways, by talking about this list, it also shows how taste evolves and changes the more time passes and when you become an adult. And now we're coming to the top 2, which by now I think everyone knows what they will be. I mean, that's pretty much the general top 2 of most fans. Actually, most fans will put the following two as their number 2 and 1 actually. So this is nothing original, but again, most people put them at their number 2 and 1 for a reason. So even though it's cliche, it's very cliche ranking my top 2, but again, you can say most people do it for a reason. But yes. But it also shows how very much taste evolves and changes over time, because you're about to hear some interesting information now when you see my top 2, which again, most people say it's pretty cliche, but it's I guess cliche for a reason, because number 2 is, to no one's surprise, the original Star Wars movie that's now known as A New Hope, even though when it first came out it was just known as Star Wars. And yes, as a kid, while Return of the Jedi was always my favorite when I was a kid, A New Hope was back then actually my least favorite, because I thought always that nothing really interesting happens, and the only two scenes that I liked was Vader's fight against Obi-Wan Kenobi and then the destruction of the Death Star. Like, those were the only two scenes I liked as a kid actually. Other than that, I thought that there was nothing particularly special about A New Hope. But again, that shows how when you are a grown-up, you actually look at the movie from an entirely different perspective than when you do as a kid, because now as a grown-up I totally see, while many people actually consider it as the favorite, as number one. Because if you ever said A New Hope is your favorite Star Wars movie, I would say good choice actually, because once again, as an adult, you watch it from an entirely different perspective, and seeing actually this, how we basically get introduced to this Star Wars universe, and then from a very opening of a giant Empire ship chasing a small ship, chasing a small rebel ship to basically establish what a threat the Empire is, and then C-3PO and R2-D2 crashing on Tatooine, and then meeting Luke Skywalker, who soon gets trained by Obi-Wan Kenobi and learns so much about the Force and all. Yeah, like now that I'm talking about it, I'm realizing that in many ways, the New Hope is very much the most mystical of all the Star Wars movies. That's what we truly delve most deep into the Force, actually, yep. And then coming to the Death Star and trying to hide from the Empire, and then Obi-Wan facing Darth Vader, and then the destruction of the Death Star. Yep. Again, A New Hope is an embodiment of how very much taste of a little kid is different than taste of a grown man. Because once again, I've been repeating it, as a kid, A New Hope was my least favorite, but for many, many years at this point, I realized how incredible this movie is. Probably the most story-driven, actually. Again, this is the movie that basically introduces us to this universe and also teaches us all about the Force and all. And yep, A New Hope is still a very incredible movie and easily number 2 on this list. But once again, if anyone ever said that this is their favorite Star Wars movie, I would say good choice, because I honestly think that Star Wars A New Hope is a also great candidate for the best Star Wars movie, because this is a really incredible movie that I only learned to appreciate in my late teens, actually. When I was like 17 and 18, that's when I finally realized how incredible this movie really is. And at number 1, and everyone knew what this is gonna be, like 90% of the people likely put it as their number 1, but number 1 is, of course, Empire Strikes Back, because Empire Strikes Back basically is an embodiment of what a true quality sequel should be. It took everything that was incredible about The New Hope, and then it expanded this story and also took it in an interesting but much darker direction. And of course, it introduced new planets starting from Hoth and then Bespin and all, and even then, even leaving out all that, it still has likely the most famous twist in cinema history. At this point, everyone knows it actually, but yeah, when it first came out, I mean, I wasn't even born when the movie first came out, but I can only imagine what it was like for the original audiences and theaters to see that twist. And I won't even mention it because everyone knows what I'm talking about. And also, this is Darth Vader at his best here, and don't get the wrong idea, I think it's really incredible in New Hope and Return of the Jedi as well, but I honestly think he shines at his best in Empire Strikes Back. And also the duel between Luke Skywalker and Darth Vader is possibly the second best lightsaber duel, only next to the Duel of the Fates with Darth Maul in The Phantom Menace, actually. I mean, emotionally wise, you can even argue it's actually better emotionally wise, but even I still think it's really greatly choreographed and all. And also Luke's training on Dagobah with Yoda is fantastic and so mystical. Like, if there is one Star Wars movie I think that all the fans can get on board with, whether sequel haters like me, sequel lovers, prequel haters, prequel lovers, or original trilogy only lovers, or maybe even first two only lovers, but yes, if there is one single Star Wars movie that I think every fan, and I mean every fan, will agree it's good, it's Empire Strikes Back. And again, many will argue it's cliche to put it at number 1, but I agree, it's cliche, but it just, that's where it belongs. It's like I can't put it anywhere else when I feel that this is where it belongs, and this is easily my favorite Star Wars movie, and that ain't ever changing. Again, Empire Strikes Back and Star Wars A New Hope are the only two movies on this list I consider straight up 10 out of 10 masterpieces without any flaws whatsoever. But overall, this is my ranking of all Star Wars movies. But I will also say this, my favorite actual Star Wars story and work is recently reviewed Knights of the Old Republic video games, both 1 and 2. Yep, Empire Strikes Back might be my favorite Star Wars movie, but my favorite Star Wars work will always remain Knights of the Old Republic video games. But again, this is my ranking of all of Star Wars movies. And as you saw on this list, I mean, I have been pretty vocal on this channel that I hate Star Wars sequels, but yes, later this year, but most likely next year, actually, I'm very much doing Star Wars sequels rewrites, actually. Yep, I'm totally rewriting the scripts from ground up and very much giving you what would my versions of Star Wars sequels be if I was the writer and the director, actually. But again, that's not going to happen until next year, most likely, actually. But again, here is my ranking of all the Star Wars movies, from my least favorite to my very favorite. And that was really lots of work to compose this list, but here we are. And also, what is your ranking of Star Wars movies? Do you agree with my list? Maybe you have some, maybe your list is different? Let me know your ranking of Star Wars movies. Press the like button, please subscribe to this channel, and I will talk to you soon in another video. Talk to you then, bye! Oh, and by the way, may the Force be with you, bye!